Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking to you from North Carolina, this is Wayne Pond, your moderator for tonight's seminar. We welcome you to the Economic Development of the West in the late 19th century. This is an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center and also sponsored by the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources Eastern Region Program, coordinated by Waynesburg University. There I am an alumnus of the staff of the National Humanities Center, and it's just a great pleasure to welcome you to our seminar this evening. Before we get underway, let me take a moment to introduce the sponsors of this program. Major support comes from the Teaching with Primary Sources program of the Library of Congress. It provides professional development opportunities for educators such as yourselves to guide you in using the digitized primary sources available from the library's website in classrooms, museums, and libraries. The TPS program also contributes to the quality of education by deepening content understanding and improving student literacy in our schools. The seminar this evening is sponsored by the National Humanities Center, which is located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. The center is the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all of the branches of the humanities. Let me give you a word of explanation. The center is a private, nonprofit organization. The main program at the Humanities Center is a fellowship program that convenes scholars from the United States and from overseas at the center for an academic year, which these scholars, these fellows as they're called, research and write books on subjects such as history, literature, language studies, philosophy, and criticism of the arts. Since the center opened in 1978, 1,300 scholars or fellows have conducted their research and writing projects here, and they have produced about 1,300 books. Now, you see these photos. The place may seem like an ivory tower, and it may in fact look like one, but the center is eager to connect with a wide array of audiences. And that, at the top of that list is teachers. The center does that online through seminars, through anthologies, the creation of anthologies of primary resources, through secondary sources, and through lessons. You can learn all about the National Humanities Center and its offerings for teachers at americainclass.org. If you're not already familiar with that site, kindly make a note of it and return to it for a wealth of information and teaching helps. After this evening's program, you will be able to access a recording of our proceedings, plus the PowerPoint that will be at the Economic Development of the West website, the same site from which you obtained the readings for this evening's seminar. You'll also find there an evaluation form. We ask, please, that you take a few minutes to complete this form. You can do it online. I'd like to emphasize that this feedback is very important to the Humanities Center. We pay careful attention to what you say and attempt to respond to your comments and suggestions. Once the center has received your evaluation, you will receive a letter documenting your participation in this evening's seminar that you'll be able to present to your home school folks and get whatever credit the seminar entitles you to. Our seminar this evening has two sets of goals. First, we will explore the forces behind the settlement and integration of the West after the Civil War. We will also consider in turn how the West as a region influenced the national landscape and picture and reflected the forces that helped to create what we call modern America. And we will provide you with fresh material to strengthen your teaching. We would like to promote the use of the material from 3 Library of Congress collections. From the American Memory Timeline, 2 of them, the American West, 1865 to 1900, and Railroads in the late 19th century, and then from the library's primary resource sets, Westward Expansion, Encounters at a Cultural Crossroads. Access to all of this material is available from the seminar webpage. On the seminar forum, which we made you aware of prior to this evening's festivities, you have posted any number of excellent questions and comments, including the following. What role did the railroads play in the development of the West? Which force motivated Western expansion more? The desire for for resources or the cultural and civilizing imperatives of manifest destiny? What forces inhibited Western expansion in the 1850s? Was Congress able to pass the Homestead Act in 1862 only because the South was not represented? What role did the influx of immigrants after the Civil War play in the development of Western settlements? What impact did the advent of cattle production have on the West and on cities to the east? How accurate were Mr. Turner's, the historian, Frederick Jackson Turner's ideas about the closing of the frontier and the West's role as a safety valve for the eastern half of the country? And did many freemen, African Americans, move west after the Civil War? These are complicated and challenging issues, and to lead us through them, we have Professor Elliot West. Elliot is the one on the left. He is the Alumni Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. Elliot, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our seminar, and if you'll give me just a moment to locate your name here on the roster, I will be able to pass the baton to you. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Professor Elliot West. Hi, Elliot.
Hey, Wayne, how you doing?
Fine.
Well, thanks. First of all, welcome to all of you. I'm so glad you're able to take part in this. Take an hour and a half of an evening to look through what I think is one of the most important and interesting aspects of American history in the period after the Civil War. Let me cover a couple of basic points first. Things I want to emphasize. First of all, looking at the period prior to the Civil War. The expansion of this country to the Pacific, I would argue, was as significant in the long run to American history and American development as was the Civil War itself. I think most of us are used to thinking of the Civil War as the primary event of the middle of the 19th century, the one that really was far more responsible than any other event or development in shaping the course of American history in the years after that. I want to try to encourage you to bring the history of the West also into this story and to consider how the expansion to the Pacific in the long run shaped the country at least as much as the terrible war between the states. Specifically, this evening, what I want to emphasize is just how extraordinarily rapidly the American West was integrated into the nation in the years roughly between 1865 and let's say around 1880. Really just 12 or 15 years, this area that had been so recently acquired and that had been on the far periphery of the nation was now part of the nation itself. Now, that happened, I think, because of 3 important factors, all of which were so important in the general history of the nation during these same years after the Civil War.
Elliot, may I interrupt for just a moment, please?
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, a technical note. I can hear a lot of paper rustling and rattling and desk movement. My point is that I believe some of you may have open microphones there in front of you, and we would respectfully ask, please, that you check the audio settings so that we don't override the proceedings with background noise. I hope that makes sense as a question. Elliot, sorry for the interruption. Please proceed.
That's quite all right. Can everyone hear me all right? I see a note here on the right saying that the voice is weak. Is it generally loud enough? Okay, good. Well, how then do we explain the extraordinary speed and completeness with which the West was brought into the nation during these years? Well, there were three things I think that were going on. First of all, it was during these years that we see really the birth of the modern American state. One of the things the Civil War did do, of course, was to increase greatly the power and the responsibility and the sweep and the scope of the federal government in American life. And it was the federal government that was responsible, largely responsible for these changes that occurred out west. Secondly, these were also years, of course, as we all know, of the rise of big business, of enormous corporations. And these corporations, private capital, were also important in bringing the West into the nation. And finally, these were years in which we saw the most extraordinary revolution in the history of the world in these areas of transportation and communication, railroads and telegraphs and so forth. And this provided a kind of a technical infrastructure that was able quite literally, to bind the far West into the nation. What's especially interesting here is that these were also episodes that would in time be treated as sort of a romantic sidelight to American history. The real American history, according to this myth, was happening in the East, the great transformations of the East. What was happening out west was a kind of a strange and exotic sidebar story. What I want to argue to you tonight is, in fact, much to the contrary, that what was going on out there in West in examples like cases like the rise of the cattle kingdom and the mining frontier, those were not sidelights to American history. They were absolutely central to what was going on in this country. And I'd like you to think along those lines as we move along. Well, let's start in the Civil War, during the Civil War itself. During the Civil War, there were several acts passed by Congress that were part of this. Here's already an example by 1862 of how the federal government was stepping in to have such profound effect on the development of the West, the integration of the West into the United States. And the first law that I've focused on here is the Homestead Act of 1862. One of the questions coming into the seminar was the Homestead Act passed primarily, or could it have been passed only because of the secession of the South and the removal of most of the Southern legislators, Southern Democrats from Congress? And the answer is yes, that's true. The South had opposed the Homestead Act before that because the assumption was, and it was true, that the Homestead Act would lead to a great tens of thousands, eventually millions, of free soil farmers. That is, farmers who did not have slaves and who were opposed to slavery moving into the West, and that eventually would isolate the South still more. So once the Southern legislatures left Congress in 1861, then Congress, dominated now by the Republican Party, was able to pass laws like the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, I'm sure most of you know, in effect offered 160 acres, a quarter section of land, free with only minimal cost to file it, to anyone who would settle on this land for 5 years and to develop it to a certain degree. Now, it turned out to be a very complicated question of whether or not the Homestead Act worked or not. It's one that historians continue to argue about. But without a doubt, the Homestead Act did result in tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of families going out west, at least to try to make a go of this. the image you have here is the man who is generally regarded as the first homesteader, the person who on January 1st of 1863 filed the first homestead claim. This was near the town today of Beatrice, Nebraska, and his claim is now the site of a national monument dedicated to the Homestead Act. They just have a new facility built there. It's really quite wonderful. I hope that those of you who are in the area might take a chance and go visit it. What we see here, Mr. Freeman is he's clearly posing for the camera, and he's giving us already, a kind of an early hint of the mythic dimension of the West. He's trying to pose himself, as sort of the classic Westerner. You can see the knife and the hatchet in his belt. The Homestead Act and homesteading was one of the great folk experiences of the 19th century West, and it's also one of the best documented experiences. So I think as teachers, what we can do is draw on the documentation of these homesteaders to get a sense to try to get a sense of what this was like on the literally on the ground, and what it was like for all persons at all levels and all ages who went out there to take this risk. And the website, I've provided for you excerpts from a diary that I discovered quite a while back. It's a wonderful document, and I've had great success using it in class, and I think you would especially, because what we have here is a diary of a teenaged girl who moves out from the east out to Kansas, and her it's quite a detailed diary, and her impressions of what that was like. So here's a chance then for your students to sort of get involved themselves and to put themselves in the place of these folks who are heading out to the far west. Luna Warner was her name, and one of the things that you see in this diary is how this young girl is first appalled at the situation that she's found herself in. She's homesick. She finds a place she's forced to live in uncomfortable, disorienting. And as you follow the diary, however, you see her gradually get used to it, and so you see this story of the evolution of this young girl and her feelings through the experience of living out in this very alien place to her, but that becomes home by the end of the diary. Well, another law passed within weeks of the Homestead Act was the so-called Pacific Railroad Act, which provided for massive government support to allow two great corporations, the Union Pacific Corporation and the Central Pacific Corporation. The Union Pacific would build a railroad, the first transcontinental railroad, starting from east to west, building out of Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would build from west to east, building out of northern California across the Sierra Nevada, and the two eventually would meet up at the northern edge of the Great Salt Lake at the Promontory Summit. This was like the Homestead Act. This was a bill, a law that had been backed by the Republican Party before the war. It was turned out to be one of the greatest examples of corruption during the Gilded Age period. We've got a recent book written on this that details, that provides in great detail the examples of that. But it did, in fact, result, whatever the corruption, whatever the faults and the failures of it, it did result in the construction of what was at the time far and away the longest railroad on Earth. Connecting the eastern system of the rail system that was highly developed by this time, out to the population on the far Pacific coast.
Elliot, if I may, I can't resist asking an impertinent question.
Sure. The
words of the honorary C.D. Hubbard here, these words have an almost religious fervor to them.
Yes.
Is that too much of a stretch to say that the hype that accompanied this grand effort. I mean, he could be talking about the second coming there.
That's a great point. I think you're absolutely right here. Now, part of this is, I suppose, just sort of rhetoric for rhetoric's sake. But there was this notion that partly because we are binding together an entire continent, partly because this was really one of the most extraordinary engineering accomplishments of the age, there was a sense that this spoke for American a superiority of this country, and it does have a kind of almost a religious feel to it. And if you read through, again, a connection on the web page gives you a series of these speeches given by these rather gaseous politicians. And you get that, you see that and hear that over and over again and again. And it was this sense, in that rhetoric, there was this sense that this was a binding together of coast to coast, that this was a kind of almost millennial event. What you see here is the map of this first transcontinental railroad, of the course that it took. And here's a cartoon in a newspaper. Notice the date, May 29th, 1869. That was the date that the famous Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, connecting these two lines. It was an enormously expensive undertaking, enterprise. And already you can see here how this is beginning to take on that sort of mythic feel to it. The coming together of the two sides is accompanied by the fleeing in the foreground there of these figures of a horseback Indian riding bareback and these bisons. So what we see here is, yet again, an expression of the notion of manifest destiny that had really come into full flower in the 1840s.
And the atmosphere, I must say, above Salt Lake City looks as bad as it is today. You're following that story, I take it.
Yes, indeed. The temperature inversions there, yeah. This is an image that might ring familiar to many of you here online. It's quite similar in its fundamentals to this much more familiar image, a highly teachable image. This is called American Progress, and it is a lithograph by a man named John Gast. What we see here is this image of America personified by this lady floating above the land. She's carrying a book meant to symbolize the rule of law. She's stringing along a telegraph line. She's being followed by railroads, and she's being accompanied by these vanguards of civilization.
Elliot, if I may, a couple of very good questions our folks are posing. The assumption is that the promontory point was in fact a predetermined place for the two railroads to meet, and a corollary question about the comparable infrastructure of technology in the United States then and now. Can you speak to those questions quickly, please?
Sure. Was it predetermined that they would meet? It was not promontory point. You often hear that or see that. I think it's the appeal of alliteration, but it was promontory summit.
Promontory summit. Forgive me.
Yes. It's on the northern banks of the Great Salt Lake. It was not determined, of course, until quite close to the end that is exactly where they would meet. And in fact, as a kind of a footnote to this. I'll go more into the details of the law in just a moment, but what the law said was that the government would loan to each of these corporations, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, thousands and thousands of dollars for every mile that they built of the railroad. For every mile in flat country, they would be loaned $16,000. For every mile in hilly country, they would get $32,000. For every mile in the mountains, $48,000. So we're talking, of course, about tens and tens of millions of dollars. And for every mile that they built, they got more money. It turns out there was nothing in the law. There was nothing in the law that required them to actually meet. it was just assumed, of course, that they would. And so as they approached each other, suddenly somebody noticed that they were building past each other, that the Union Pacific was building past, paralleling the Central Pacific and vice versa, raking in the money. And so Congress had to very quickly convene and pass a law that required them to back up and actually to touch at the place of the golden spike.
A question about the comparable technological infrastructures. Is that? Please go ahead.
It's a very interesting question. I think what you might think of it in this way: what was happening in the 19th century with the railroad and the telegraph was as profound in its implications, I think, as what would happen in the 20th century with the development of infrastructure such as radio and television, telephone lines, and of course eventually the internet. I would argue, in fact, that the telegraph was the single most important breakthrough in the history of all human communication. There's a book about the telegraph. It's called The Victorian Internet, and it makes a similar point. But I think the point of the question is, that we are seeing in these 2 centuries these extraordinary developments, and in a way, what we think of as a knitting together of the world with the net really goes back to what we're looking at right now on the screen.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Well, looking at these 2 images, I think that we can get a sense of how this was being seen by the American people and was being touted by American political and cultural leaders. I'm sure many of you have used the illustration on the right before in class, and you can certainly get a sense of the sort of the moral meanings behind it. I wonder if anyone has any comments on this, on what's being depicted here, what we're seeing. Can we sort of take these images apart?
There's a number of comments turning up here, Elliot. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box. Your primary focus is there on the PowerPoint. The portrayal of Native Americans. One of our participants likens the whole thing to Lot's wife fleeing and not looking back.
Right.
Yeah, the settlers have things with them, while the Native Americans have only their horses, adding to that rushed feeling. Our teachers are indeed picking up on the implications of these images.
Good, that's good, yes. Yeah, I mean, the Indians, as often, of course, are portrayed as sort of a simple peoples, savages even, with no technology of their own. You might make a point also of sort of the coming of light into darkness. If you can see the progression from right to left in the illustration of how light is being brought into a darkened land. But in any case, of course, the larger point is this is civilization coming into a land of savagery, and that those images that sort of sum up the savage world, the simple world of wilderness and timeless wild in the West are giving way. The notion here, once again, this is sort of a classic expression of manifest destiny as it was taking form in the latter part of the 19th century.
Elliot, couple of our folks are asking about the female figure. Is it Liberty? One asks, is it Columbia? Is there a specific answer to those questions?
There's no specific answer to it, but most often she's described of as Columbia. And she's it's an example of how quite often America has been depicted in this almost classical sense of a feminine deity. Any other questions or any other comments on this?
I'm keeping an eye on not immediately, but I will pass them on to you. Elliot, one of my functions is politely to remind, keep the train running on time.
Oh, right.
Pardon the expression. We've now met in the middle, and and we're going to keep this train on time. It is 7:30. We have 1 hour, and I just want to put that out, Elliot, as we move through the remainder of our slides to keep you on schedule.
That's a good point. Well, what we see here next is land grants that were given to the railroad. So let me summarize again a little bit about how this law was supposed to work. As I said, by this law, the government would loan millions and millions of dollars to the railroads to construct this first transcontinental line. What you see here on the map are later transcontinentals that were built connecting to the Pacific coast. So how was the railroad supposed to pay this money back? And it was an awful lot of money. Well, the notion here was that these railroads, these corporations would be not loaned but given huge amounts of public land along the right-of-way of the railroads. The idea here was that this land was virtually worthless now because there was no connection to the outside world. Once you built the railroad, the land will become valuable, and the railroads could then sell that land to settlers and use the income from the sale of those lands to pay off the loans. It was an ingenious idea. It was almost like making, creating something from nothing. It never worked that way, but that was the notion. That was the theory. What you'll see down here at the left-hand corner is the pattern of these land grants. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific, and then later other transcontinentals, were given by the government every other section of land for 10 and then 20 miles on either side of the railroads. We're talking enormous amounts of land. Every other section will be held by the government and sold for its own income. But for the railroads to benefit from this, they would have to sell this land, and so consequently, these railroads. Here's giving you an idea of just how much land we're talking about. The amount of land proved up under the Homestead Act, that is actually where title actually passed to the homesteaders between 1862 and 1880, just under 20 million acres. The land given to the railroads during those same years, roughly six times the amount, 127 million acres.
Elliot, just parenthetically, when did the time zones come into play?
The time zones were first introduced by railroads themselves. That's a good question, because once you begin to transport people and things over such distances, you've got to somehow coordinate all of that rail traffic. And that means that everybody, once you begin to communicate, to set up these schedules, everybody's got to be on the same time schedule. So the railroads initiated the time zones. It wasn't until the 1880s that the government, that the Congress finally, came along with the railroads and made them part of the nation that we have today. So the railroads then were given tens of millions of acres of land, but it was useless to them unless they could sell it, and so consequently, the railroads became some of the most effective boosters of Western settlement that we had. Railroads, they hired literally hundreds of agents to travel across the Atlantic into Europe, as far as southern Russia, to try to recruit people to come over to America, to come out on the railroads and to settle the land, to buy land from them, and of course to create a market that they would be able to use. They formed their own dozens of newspapers in Europe, and they also, of course, recruited people across the United States. What you have here is an advertisement by one of those railroads that show us, exactly what they're trying to do. So the railroads, to get back to one of the questions I think before the seminar, what effect did the railroads have on settlement? Well, they had a huge effect, an enormous effect. They probably brought more people out to settle in the West than were brought out under the Homestead Act. Incidentally, for these railroad grants, there's material, if you look over in the website under the Library of Congress materials to find. You'll see some very interesting stuff on land grants and on the construction of the railroads themselves. And on the website, if you'll click on the one for the Spatial History Center in Stanford University, you can see the remarkable spread of railroads during these years over a very short span of time.
How many railroads were involved in this immense project? Can you generalize, sort of start to finish, a dozen, 2 dozen, how many?
Well, as you can see from this map, these are the major transcontinentals. But for every one of these major transcontinentals, there were smaller, what we call feeder lines that ranged off of them. So a complete map of railroads would show a sort of an intricate web. You wouldn't find too many of them in the center of the country of the West yet, but on the edges there were a lot of them. And in fact, if you'll go to that site at Stanford University, you'll see a sort of a time-lapse series of maps showing the spread of this steel web that's beginning to bind the West into the nation.
One question that comes up here, Elliot, were the railroads essentially the impetus for immigration, or do you look from the other end of the pipeline? The immigration started to occur, and the railroad people realized the potential there.
It was really both. All immigration could be thought of as kind of a push and a pull. There were all sorts of things pushing people out of Europe during this time. There were the pogroms against Jewish populations in Eastern Europe and Russia. There were Germans from Russia. These were Protestant German sects in southern Russia whose sons were being conscripted to the army, and so they wanted a place to go. There were all kinds of economic dislocations in Europe that were pushing people out. But there was also the pull of the Homestead Act. People in Europe at first would not believe the Homestead Act, believe that it existed. The idea of free land was such an incredible dream to them that they couldn't imagine that it was actually available to them. And the same thing was true of the railroads. The people coming over there offering them free tickets across the Atlantic, free rail tickets out to the jumping off places, giving them all sorts of advantages. So,
Elliot, I remember in another context talking to a novelist whose name was Herbert Gold, whose forebears came to the United States about the time that you're describing now. His forebears were Central European Jewish, and to be honest with you, I can't remember the exact name or how to pronounce it, but the story that Mr. Gold told was that his great-great-grandfather changed the name to Gold, mainly because he believed the stories that the streets of America were paved with gold. That must be an old one for you historians.
Yeah, there were all sorts of incredible examples of that. One of my favorites is an ad I found once in a newspaper in Indiana that advertised what was called gold grease. And this was something you would take with you out to California.
Wow.
Once you got out to California, you would strip down, take all your clothes off, slather this gold grease all over your body, and roll around to pick up the gold dust that was everywhere on the ground. Yep, plenty of stories like that.
We should do a seminar on snake oil salesmen.
Well, railroads in turn would have a huge impact on other developments in the West. One of them, of course, was to bring over settlers, to bring out settlers to encourage immigration into the West. But also the railroad was critical for the development of other aspects of the Western economy, including probably the one that's most associated with the American West after the Civil War, and that was the cattle industry.
Let me give you a break, and you can get a sip of water, and I'll read this for you, Elliot. This is from a man named Joseph G. McCoy. This young man conceived the idea of opening up an outlet for Texan cattle, realizing the great disparity of Texas values and northern prices of cattle. He set himself to thinking and studying to hit upon some plan whereby these great extremes would be equalized. That phrase, great extremes, sounds like it's a sort of subtext in a lot of what you're discussing here.
Yeah, it is indeed. McCoy is often called the father of the range cattle industry. But he was a Union veteran who found himself found himself out in Texas at the end of the war. And what McCoy saw was that this is sort of a classic example of supply and demand begging to be brought together. At the end of the Civil War, there was a huge demand for beef in what is roughly the northeastern quadrant of the nation. That is the Union states in the Ohio Valley and the Northeast and the Middle Atlantic states. The demand for cattle had grown greatly during the Civil War, in part because cattle was what the Union Army used to feed its soldiers for meat. It was the most efficient way to provide meat for them, to bring cattle herds along with the army. In any case, there was this great demand, and because of the war, there was a great shortage of cattle in the Northeast. Most of it had been used to feed the soldiers. At the same time, there was this enormous supply of cattle down in Texas, southern Texas, where there were these enormous herds of Texas Longhorns, of Texas cattle, but a very small population, and they were really worthless. So consequently, the price of a cow up in, let's say, New York was probably $25 to $30. The price of a cow in southern Texas, well, they were virtually, you couldn't sell them. There was no market for them whatsoever. What McCoy saw was that if we could somehow bring together the supply of southern Texas and central Texas with the demand of the Northeast, that you could have a business. You could make some money. Well, now we had a way to bring these two things together, to link supply and demand. And the way was, of course, the railroad. The red lines there on the map are those rail lines that are being built across the plains. The green lines on the map are the trails by which these Texas cattle could be driven across the public domain. It's free grass, free land, driven up to connect with the rail lines in places first like Abilene, and then these other towns you can see there, Dodge City. And those cattle then could be loaded on cattle cars, rail cars, and taken back to be slaughtered in places like Kansas City and Chicago. We now had an industrial slaughtering operation that was developed during the Civil War, and the meat then could be processed. A lot of it was put in cans, laced with all sorts of chemicals, including formaldehyde, believe it or not. And then that finished product then could be distributed across the Northeast, again, by this new transportation system of railroads.
Elliot, one of our folks observes that he didn't know that the Chisholm Trail split in Oklahoma to arrive at two different locations. Was that because of the railroads?
What was happening here, one of the things that was happening is Kansas and Nebraska were also being increasingly settled by those folks coming in from the east, following the Homestead Act, following the railroads. And as farmers moved into a place like Abilene, this conflict developed between these two economies, the agricultural economy of farmers, the cattle economy of the cowboys and the cattle industry. This was partly just a competition for land. It was partly a cultural conflict, as the family frontier of the farmers was coming into contact with these cowboys who were not exactly paragons of virtue for these farming families. So what happens was that gradually the cattle industry, the cattle trails, were forced westward in front of the expanding farming frontier. So if you were to track these cattle towns over time, it begins with Abilene, then it's Ellsworth, later it's Dodge City and Oglala in Nebraska, and so consequently you have to develop new trails to connect the cattle and the Texas cattle up there to the rail lines. Okay, so what we see here really is this chapter in Western history that's been so highly romanticized. That is really, I think, a perfect example of the emergence of these new Gilded Age businesses in the years after the Civil War. This is an example of a Gilded Age enterprise in the same way that petroleum is, in the same way that iron and steel is, under people like Rockefeller and people like Carnegie. And in many ways, this illustrates how what was happening in Gilded Age industrializing America as well or better than what we can see in the East. So this is a theme that I want to emphasize to you, that we can look at the West and see great examples of these larger trends of the transformation of the nation.
Elliot, is it, echoing a question here from one of our participants, is it fair to equate the whole issue of economic competition among the railroads because of these lines that were being drawn?
Because of the lines being drawn.
The question is, let me read this verbatim. Was there economic competition among the railroad lines? In other words, who held the power?
Sure, of course there was. Although there was also these people sort of colluding together to fix prices and so forth. But yeah, there's bitter competition, and that contributed to the economic problems of these railroads. Virtually every one of these transcontinentals, with the exception of the Central Pacific, I think, at one point went bankrupt.
Fair enough. Thank you. Let me jump in again here and give you a rest, Elliot. Here is a PowerPoint, the words of George Martin. The range life didn't stack up to home life with a good bed to bunk in and a mother to fuss over fixing the chunks. But the work got into my blood and I couldn't leave it. I stayed with the cattle and hoss business so long as I was able to work. How about this?
Well, George Martin. He was just an ordinary cowhand, and I tossed this in here because it's a fairly unusual or rare example of personal testimony from cowboys themselves. People didn't write a lot, but I think it's something that you can use in your classes to get a sense of what it was like for the people who were actually on the ground, what this romanticized life of the cowboy was really like. And we have some diaries as well. I've given you some links to those on the website. And I believe also over there again in the Library of Congress documents over on the left-hand side of the website, you have something called Beef and Beans. It's a good life, a good look into what life is like for these folks.
Shades of Mel Brooks.
Really, Blazing Saddles, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, here's yet another example of how a development of the West was having enormous impact on the nation at large. The range cattle industry was helping to transform the tastes and what was on the dinner tables of Americans in the East. This was something that had a huge impact upon the American economy generally, and that is the extraordinary expansion of production of gold and silver in the far West during these same years. What we see here is a slide showing the production of gold and silver during these pertinent years. You get a sense of the enormity of it. And even more so here, this is a slide that shows you gold production across the world between 1780 and 1900. And if you look at it, what you see here, of course, is this steep increase in the slope. It looks like you're suddenly, climbing a mountain or trying to climb a ski slope right around the time of 1850. And that, of course, corresponds with the discovery of gold in California. This was what I would call the greatest coincidence in American history. Gold was discovered in California by a man named James Marshall in late January of 1848. As I remember, January 23rd, I think. This was 9 days, and I figured it out. It's roughly 200 hours before the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that gave the United States California. In other words, at virtually the same instant that this country acquired California, we began to realize that this was the single richest place on earth. and the amount of gold produced over the next years was absolutely phenomenal.
Elliot, if I may, let me jump in with a couple of more or less related questions here. One of our folks asks about the railroads and the Sherman Antitrust Act. Another of our participants observes that you are arguing that the railroads had a great deal of competition among and between themselves. This teacher says that he shows in his classes that the railroads had more power than the cattle owners, since they were the cattle owners were totally dependent on the railroads, and asks the question, is it fair to say that the populist movement arose out of that conflict? Those are very large questions.
Indeed, yeah. That's certainly true. The railroads were not just the largest and the wealthiest corporations in the nation, institutions in the nation. They were also among the most powerful. And there was this great resentment on the part of not just cattlemen but farmers as well, of course, that they really had no choice in terms of railroads they could use. And in local terms, a railroad was a monopoly. You're not going to take your grain or your cattle, 180 miles to the north to get on another one. You've got to use the local one. And it was certainly out of that kind of resentment, that kind of conflict that you see as one of the important factors in the rise of populism in the latter part of the 19th century. There's also concern that these corporations are, in effect, as I said, local monopolies, and that they are combining with each other. And it's out of that resentment, that concern, that the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed as well.
The corollary question, how did Congress benefit or suffer alternatively because of the power of the railroads?
Well, first thing to say there is that again, the corruption of these railroads in the creation of these transcontinentals and in the aftermath of it was just really quite breathtaking.
In other words, the railroads were really in charge of Congress.
In many ways, they were, absolutely. I mentioned a bit earlier about a recent book. This is a book that's called Railroaded. It's by Richard White of Stanford University, and it's certainly one of the most devastating analyses of the level of this corruption. It's pretty astonishing. Yeah. Well, again, what you can see here in this graph is this remarkable increase of wealth in the form of gold, and gold was considered, the most sort of the quintessential form of wealth itself. This is again gold production in the world. Notice how steeply it goes up, but remember that most of that increase in world gold production was happening in the United States, and specifically in California and in the West. Just to give you one small notion of how much gold we're talking about here, I ran across this a couple of years ago. In 1852, the government had established a mint in the city of San Francisco to turn the raw gold into bars. In 1852, the San Francisco Mint was processing so much gold that the furnaces could not handle it, and they discovered that gold dust was literally being blown out through the smokestacks, the chimneys of the mint. And so they sent people around to the rooftops of several hundred yards radius around the mint to literally sweep up the gold that was being blown out over the city,
giving new meaning to the expression "the Golden State."
The Golden State, or instead of streets paved with gold, this is rooftops dusted with gold dust. So that's a lot of wealth. Think for a second here what this meant for this country. At the very moment that this country was embarking in what was one of the most expensive undertakings that we would ever do, and that is transitioning from essentially an agricultural nation into an urban industrial nation. Think what that cost. At exactly the moment that we were really beginning to do that, to accomplish that, we suddenly found that we had the money to do it. This amount of money was being pumped into the economy. And I can't think of a better example of how westward expansion and how the development of the West and the integration of the West would have a profound impact upon the development of the nation at large.
One of our folks, Elliot, asks if America or the United States, what role did it play in the creation of the so-called gold standard?
Oh, well, it was very important. We were, obviously, this is among other things, the United States is emerging during these years, and this would finally come to its culmination in the 20th century, as the economic giant of the world, and specifically in terms of production. So this became, the question of the gold standard became an international issue during this time, and because we were the supplier of most of the gold in the world, we were very much at the center of it.
Thank you.
Gold was just one of these natural resources that we found in the West once we acquired it. Most of these things, of course, we didn't know were there, but we discovered that the land that we had acquired between 1845 and 1848 was arguably the most concentrated storehouse of natural resources on Earth at that time. An important example of this was copper. Copper was the most important non-precious metal. Outside of gold and silver, copper was the most important, the most valuable metal in the world at that time, because copper was so important for industrialization. Copper was needed in the building of factories. Copper was needed for the wires of the telegraph. And we discovered that that the United States had some of the richest copper deposits on Earth. Now the map you see here represents copper deposits today. Many of those discoveries were made after the time that we're talking about. But if you look at the West, you'll see those sort of parts of it almost covered with those black dots. Huge copper deposits in the Southwest in Arizona. The largest copper mine in the world at that time in Butte, Montana, up in Montana. So not only gold and silver, but copper as well. Timber. We were, among other things, in a transition not just from small town agricultural America to urban industrial America, but we're also in the transition between the America of wood and the America of iron and steel and brick. But we were on the transition, and we still had a voracious demand for wood and timber. And the Pacific Northwest, as you can see in this photograph, had a lot of wood. A lot of it in very big trees. So in retooling America, remaking America, we had the kinds of things. Yet another resource out west that we would put to good use. Wood was used in things like this bridge back in Vermont. It was also used in mining, and here's a nice segue from how these two things were brought together. In this case, timber and gold mining. Once the surface deposits of gold were exhausted, then they began to dig underground down to the so-called mother lode, the lodes of the gold veins and the silver veins in the earth. And once you did that, you had to figure out a way somehow to prop up those mines. And the result was the development of technologies like this. This is called square set timbering, in which you dig down to the earth and you create these timbers to sort of keep the whole thing from falling in on itself as you're sort of gradually gutting out these whole mountainsides.
This slide calls to mind a question that came up a few minutes ago, Elliot. What date do we associate with the Comstock lode?
Comstock, the original discovery was made in 1858 and 59. It had been a gold mining area before that. But in 1858, a couple of prospectors noticed that there was this other, what they call this nasty silver stuff, and they had it assayed over in California, and they discovered that it was silver in extraordinary purity. The greatest of the Comstock discoveries didn't come until later, until the 1870s, the so-called Big Bonanza, when they got down very, very deep in the earth, far deeper than any mines had ever been dug before, and discovered almost unimaginable amounts of silver there.
Question about the technologies, Elliot, that were used in the finding, the development, the processing of all these precious metals. Was that a sophisticated area of American technology or science?
That's a great question, and the answer to that is that during these years, the American West was the great laboratory for mining engineering on Earth. The greatest schools of mining engineering were Germany, but these German specialists would come over, be hired over into the American West, and they would develop these increasingly sophisticated methods of mining and of processing. Once the gold and silver was taken out of the earth, we had to figure out the most efficient ways to extract it from its surrounding material. And to process it into its final form. So this was, among other things, these were years in which, if you were to sort of graph a curve in the sophistication of mining engineering, you would see as steep a curve in that as you would in the production of gold and silver. And again,
I'm not sorry, Elliot, go ahead.
It was the West where this was happening. The West was sort of the center, the center of the universe for mining engineers.
I was going to say, I'm not sure if the time frame is correct, but I would certainly commend to our teachers Wallace Stegner's marvelous novel, Angle of Repose, which deals with engineering and mining in the West. Is that about this time period, or does that come later?
Yeah, it's a little bit later, but I would echo that. In my opinion, this is our finest Western novel, Angle of Repose. It's based.
Ladies and gentlemen, we did not plan this. Honest, that just popped into my mind. I wondered about that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful novel, and it's based on the actual life of a couple who's out there, a woman who became a very prominent writer, an illustrator in the West. But it goes into wonderful detail about about the mining engineering there, and also in parts of Latin America. Yeah. So this is what we see here is the West needing a lot of wood to develop its industry in gold and silver, and the West having a lot of wood to do that. One historian has estimated that the amount of wood in the Comstock lode would be enough to build an entire town, city, of 50,000 ranch-style home, two-bedroom homes. So,
my goodness,
a lot of wood needed.
Levittown before Levittown.
That's right.
Elliot, quick reminder, we have just passed the 8 o'clock moment. We have just under 30 minutes to go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mining, like the cattle industry, when we think of the cattle industry, we think of sort of the lonesome cowboy out there, singing to the sleeping herds. Whereas, in fact, what I've argued to you is that the cattle industry was really basically a late 19th century American industry. Similarly, the image that we have of the mining frontier is of that sourdough sort of hunkering down by the stream with a gold pan, extracting gold from the gravels below him. But mining was an even better example of what was essentially an industry. It was an industrial setting, and it was ruled by corporations in the same way that railroads were. Eventually, the cattle industry was. The Plains cattle industry eventually was financed primarily by distant corporations. And in the case of the mining industry, this was also an industry that developed elaborate new technologies. This is an example of what's called hydraulic mining. Those cliffs that you can see there were laid down over millions of years by ancient rivers, and just as the living streams had gold dust in them, so there was gold dust in those hills, in them bar hills. The problem was how to get it out. Somebody figured out that what you could do was find a water source at a higher altitude, funnel that water source down, channel it through along sluices like this. Enough of these sluices, these were in effect sort of wooden artificial waterways. Enough of these sluices were built during these years in California, someone figured out, to connect Northern California with Boston. if you can imagine a wooden river running all the way across the continental United States, that's how many of these sluices were built in California.
The Roman aqueducts come to mind, Elliot.
Yeah, right.
Is that a bad analogy or a good one?
It's not a bad analogy at all. If you look at some of these, the engineering of them is really quite astonishing. Some things were hundreds and hundreds of feet up cliffs built across these cliffs. Well, this water, as it was carried down through these sluices, through these wooden rivers, then was funneled into these narrow water cannons, and the force of that water being borne downward by gravity was absolutely astonishing. And it was those powerful streams of water then that would be directed against these hillsides. In which you would have, in a matter of moments, the erosion of hillsides. It would take hundreds or thousands of years. And all of that muck then would be brought down to these, you can see down at the bottom of the page of the photo, into these sluices, and it was put in settling pans, and then the gold was gradually extracted. So this is a couple of things you can say about this. This is essentially an industrial enterprise. Mines essentially were underground factories, and on the surface they were these industries in which these industrial settings in which these new technologies were being used to extract this very valuable resource. They were also, as you can see here, agents of appalling environmental damage. You can fly over parts of California, look down, and you can still see the scars on the land left by this kind of mining.
Two quick questions, Elliot. What was the power behind these water sources, and what year approximately was that photograph taken?
I'm not entirely sure of the second question. I'm not entirely sure of the year. I would have to guess that this was probably in the 1870s. By the 1880s, this was being shut down out of opposition from farmers. Because, among other things, what this did, of course, was hopelessly pollute the streams where all of this ended up. To the point where the farmers could not use them for irrigation. The other, what is the power? It was basically the power of gravity.
Yeah.
You would just allow, water is very, very heavy, and if you allow it to sort of make its way down and then funnel it into, compress it into those cannons, the force of that water is just astonishing. Well, what this also meant, among other things, was that the workforce in these mines becomes essentially an industrial workforce. These people working, whether they're working down below or whether they're working up at a hydraulic, are essentially workers in an industrial enterprise, workers in a Western factory, really essentially no different from those working in the East.
I've heard of Poker Flats, Elliot, but where is Dutch Flat?
Dutch Flat is in Northern California. And the so-called Mother Lode. I've given you on the website a full page from this article, and it really captures the kind of spirit that you see there.
Wow.
The lofty hills, the broad plains, the long cliffs are washed away, and their ruin is completed by nothing else than a shaft of water a few inches in diameter. There is no more spirit, and here's a key sentence. There is no more spirit in the work here than there is in the work of a granite quarry. So these are people who are sort of just doing grunt labor for very low pay, in the same way that you would find, say, in a glass factory in Maine or in a textile mill in North Carolina.
Are you going to leave us with any romantic illusions about the West, Elliot?
There are not too many. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I will say, however, of course, that the West is an extraordinarily beautiful place. At least you can say that. It also brought, and this touches on a question that was that we brought into this seminar. It also brought into the West not just mining, but all of these enterprises, this extraordinary range of peoples from all over the world. California, more than any other place, was called by one editor the World's Convention. It was, I think, probably without question, the most mixed population for a place its size on planet Earth at that time. Dame Shirley, she was a wonderful English writer who came out and wrote a series of letters back that described life out in the diggings. Here's a Here is something from France at the time. The French sent something like 50,000 Frenchmen after the Revolution of 1848 out to California. You can see here, it's a great illustration. This is Gold Mountain behind this woman. To the left, people going into Gold Mountain are wearing ragged clothes. They're coming out on the right, on the other side, dressed plushly, literally borne down by sacks of gold dust. So this is a song that was being performed, and a dance performed in France at the time.
Elliot, remind us who was the famous Frenchman who came to America and wrote about his travels, and I'm just blanking on the name, but it stands in stark contrast to the illustration that we're looking at here.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure who you mean.
It'll come to me, and I'll.
But it was Tocqueville, of course, before.
Tocqueville, of course. Yeah,
that's a good bit earlier than this. He was
1820s or so,
1820s,
right?
Yeah. This is a very different America from the one that he
Absolutely.
That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Including folks like the Chinese, who were far and away, the most culturally outliers of all of the history of American immigration. So in the West, then, we see this really extraordinary range of ethnic groups brought over here. Remember, they're coming over from Europe, from all over Europe and in Russia, brought over by the railroads. They're coming out to the mining towns, drawn to this place. They're drawn to the lumber industry, the Pacific Northwest. Huge amounts of Finns out to the Pacific Northwest in the lumber industry.
One of our participants, Elliot, makes this interesting comment, proposes to use that illustration that we have on the screen now as a stark contrast to the images of the Opium Wars. Now, is that concurrent, or does that come later?
It's concurrent. And these are also years in which we see a rising hostility toward the Chinese out of economic competition, and the opium trade becomes a center part of that. Yeah. So again, one more way in which I think the West of reality differed from the West of our impressions, cultural impressions, is that when we think of the melting pot in America, I think it's fair to say that most of us grew up thinking of the East, and specifically the East Coast. It was on the East Coast in places like New York, where you found the greatest portion of the population from outside the nation. In fact, for the census of 1870, New York would rank 10th among all states and territories in terms of the percentage of foreign-born in it. New York had the highest percentage of all foreign-born in all states along the Atlantic coast, just about 1/4, 26%. It would have ranked behind, in terms of percentage of foreign-born persons, ranked behind Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, California, Utah, and Dakota. The West was then, the West would remain, the West is today, far and away the most ethnically diverse part of the country.
Why is Arizona at the head of the pack there?
I think probably that's because, it's a little sort of trick of statistics, I think probably that's because Arizona has a fairly small population in 1870, and a very large portion of those population were people who had been living there for a few generations, but had been born before 1848, and so technically had been born in Mexico. So that's misleading. But look at Idaho.
Yeah.
1/2 of all persons in Idaho have been born outside the United States. And notice that so many of these at the top of the list are mining states: Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, California.
Right.
So the West then was the great melting pot. The West was the great sort of ethnic stew pot of America in these years, not the East.
It's been called a melting pot, a stew pot, and it's also been called a salad.
The tossed salad, yes.
Yeah.
That never really sort of blends the way a melting pot would, yeah. All of this, of course, raises the question, what about the people who were living there before all of this happened? That is, native peoples, Indian peoples. And the answer of the government was, well, they've got to either withdraw to these islands within the West, or they must be defeated and killed. So the government's policy then was to set up what would be called reservations, and to confine Indians into these places to allow the full development, the continued development of the West. So all of this has this other rather dark side to it. Here are a couple of maps, again from the Library of Congress collection, that shows where a lot of these tribes ended. They were forced to go to Indian Territory, to today Oklahoma, and they were concentrated there, sort of out of the main flow of population westward, out of the main areas of development. And those who resisted that paid the price. Here, of course, is a depiction of the most famous, one of the most famous military episodes in the Indian Wars out west, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This was an early depiction of it by a man named Cassidy Adams, based on a painting by F. Otto Becker, Custer's Last Fight. One art historian has estimated that this picture was seen at the time by more Americans than any other image, save with the single exception of Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, because that was on a $1 bill. That's because this was bought by Anheuser-Busch, and Anheuser-Busch provided it free to any saloon that would buy Anheuser-Busch beer, Budweiser beer. So this was seen, this was in virtually every saloon across the entire nation.
I think that has got to be the most egregious example of corporate self-service. Is there one that exceeds it? My goodness.
I can't think of one offhand, and this, again, gets back to this theme of how this whole process was gradually being integrated as well into American mythology. Here we have, of course, the famous Boy General meeting his end. But what's interesting for us as teachers of history is that we can compare that to other images, these from Indian peoples themselves. This is a depiction of that same battle by a Lakota, a Western Sioux kicking bear. You can sort of set them side by side, ask your students to look at them, draw some of the distinctions and differences between the two. The one on the right obviously has Indians at the center rather than George Custer.
One of our folks, sorry, Elliot, one of our folks asks about the contrast between the Iroquois of New York and the ancestral lands of the Western tribes. How were the Iroquois able essentially to hold on to their inheritance, whereas the Western tribes were not? Was it again, a very large question.
Yeah, very large question. The Iroquois were able to hold on. First of all, they lost a lot of their lands, of course, and many of them withdrew into Canada, where their descendants remain today. But the Iroquois had a much longer association with first of all the English, the Dutch, and then the English and the United States. Much more complex association. But I think the main answer to that question is, once again, to go back to a point I made at the outset, and that is the extraordinary speed with which the West was controlled and integrated, brought into the nation. It took many generations, but basically more than 200 years for the land east of the Mississippi to be fully controlled and to brought under control of a central government. The same process west of the Mississippi, an area twice as big, happened basically in one generation. Basically in about 25 years. And when things happened that quickly, the Indians just lost their land with breathtaking speed, as this image shows here. You can see here on the lower right is a situation at the time of, not long after the American Revolution, about the time of the Constitution went into effect. All of that in black is Indian country. 60 years later, it's now in the far west. But look what happens then. In only 30 years, that land is essentially all taken from them.
This has got to be a fairly recent piece. Timothy Egan still writes for the Times, does he not?
Yes. Yeah. Won, of course, the Pulitzer, I think, for his book on the Dust Bowl. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Indians, at the same time as being defeated and confined to reservations, are also beginning to be heroized and turned to sort of these mythic figures of the, the defeated, the noble defeated foe. And the photographs like this very famous photographer, Edward Curtis, whom the Indians call the shadow catcher. Images like this of the Nez Perce people of the Pacific Northwest. So the government's policy was never, contrary to what you often hear, it was never to exterminate the Indians. There were individuals who called for that. But the government policy always, and had been from the birth of the Republic, had been the dream of assimilating Indians, of turning them into mainstream Americans. And the process here was to be done with education. The idea was that you control the rising generation, you control the children, or you control the future. And the most famous method of accomplishing this, or trying to accomplish this, was in the form of boarding schools, in particular off-reservation boarding schools, where Indian children would be taken from across the West, would be transported to several of these schools across the country. The most famous of them was at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was the first of them. And it was there that they were to be transformed. You can get all kinds of examples of photographs like this, sort of before and after photographs from the National Archives. Those were Chiricahua Apaches on the left on arrival at Carlisle, and there you have them 4 months later on the right. They are, they're everything from the cut of their hair to the clothes that they're wearing is changing.
Elliot, a question that is implicit in a couple of the comments that we're getting here. How do you teach this kind of image with sufficient, what would you call it, sympathy or understanding when you're talking to students today who may not appreciate all of the history behind those pictures?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think you would have to go into at least some of sort of the cultural underpinnings of these young people who are being brought to places like Carlisle, and to understand something about the importance of family to them, the importance of place to them. Their place, who they were and where they were really inseparable. You take people, Indian peoples, out of their homelands and they lose their identity.
One of our folks says, makes an assertion, let me ask you to comment on it. Was assimilation equal to annihilation?
Certainly not physical annihilation. It was, I think, cultural annihilation, or an attempt at it. And the government was perfectly open and open about this. The official government role was to simply to eradicate native cultures. The argument was we cannot have a unified nation as long as there are people who are culturally unassimilated inside of it.
Would you call pictures like this a form of propaganda?
At the time they were, exactly. We look back on this, of course, with great sympathy for what was going on, but this was used at the time as a badge of pride. Look what we've done. Look what we were doing here. We were making Americans.
That sounds so noble.
It does, and it was seen as the way. And I should say, the people who were arguing along these lines and the people who were creating these schools were called the Friends of the Indians. They were saying, this is the only way to save these people. And we are trying to help them as best we can. It's a very, morally, it's a pretty messy set of questions.
Very sticky, very sticky.
Here's one example that you might consider using in class. This is an extraordinary story of a particular Indian. His name was Ishi. He was a member of a tribe in Northern California that was one of many that were thought to be totally annihilated by the bloodshed that followed the gold rush. But in fact, he had survived with a handful of others up in the hills, and much later, in 1912, he wandered out of the hills to give himself up. He was taken to the to the University of California at Berkeley, where he was taken in by this man, the bearded man, Alfred Kroeber, who was the leading American Indian anthropologist at the time, and lived for a few years before he died of tuberculosis. But he what we see in his story was this tragic story of what happened to so many Indians, especially in California. But it's also this incredibly powerful story of how this man sort of literally walks out of the past. It's like as if he sort of came out of a time machine. And it works very, very well in class to give students a sense of what was going on out there.
The question comes up from several of our folks. Is this Ishi's death mask?
Yeah. He died, as I said, of tuberculosis. He died, unfortunately, while Kroeber was away, and consequently, and this was done this was done quite often. Once he died, he was decapitated. And his head sent back to the Smithsonian Institution for study. And only recently, in the past several years, was it repatriated, brought back out to California, and the closest descendants of the Yahi took it up to the hills and buried it by their own, in secret, by their own ceremonies.
Not to trivialize, Elliot, but there was a wonderful Timothy Hutton film called Iceman about, I don't know, 15 years ago. That now that I see these pictures and hear you speaking, it occurs to me that might have been Ishi might have been the inspiration for that kind of.
Could have been the same thing. Yeah, it's a. Now I've also given you some links here if you want to follow up on these. And there are also videos you can get on YouTube and find films of Ishi.
Again, folks, all of this will be available to you on the website, so you don't need to rush to write these web addresses down this instant.
Okay, we've only got about seems to be about 5 minutes left.
Well, here are the words of Frederick Jackson Turner. Up to our own day, American history has been in a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. You have certainly, if you haven't deflated that completely, Elliot, you've certainly invited a lot of very good questions.
Yes, indeed. This, of course, is one of the most important figures in the history of American history. And what Turner was arguing is that Americans are Americans essentially because of what happened on the frontier and because of what happened on the expansion of the American of the West. And these were all very positive things that Turner was talking about. When he said Americans are different, he was really saying Americans were better. Well, Turner is a kind of an academic example of how during these same years the American West and American westward expansion was being turned into the great American myth, and in many ways the quintessential American story. It's kind of our creation myth, the creation myth of the American people.
All it took was Hollywood to seal the deal, huh?
Right, and it was coming along soon. Before Hollywood, there were writers like Owen Wister,
right?
The famous novel *The Virginian*, in which he has a story of an Easterner who comes out west and sort of falls in love with the country. As this line shows here, he's arguing saying among other things that this is another world.
That could be Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle.
Indeed, exactly. And that was, of course, one of the first Wests, some of the earlier West, upstate New York.
Right.
Artists take part in this. Note now, Owen Wister. This is Frederick Remington. Others, Theodore Roosevelt. The sort of the cowboy as president. These people who have such a hand in creating the 20th century image of the American West, they're all Easterners. These are all people who come out of the East, who are frustrated in many ways with life in the East, with the life of the industrializing East, and they begin to portray the West not as what I have argued to you this evening that it really was. That is, a place that was in its own way, as caught up in the changes of the day, in its own way, as dominated by big money and big capital, and in its own way, the scene of expansion of federal power and big government, in its own way, as a polyglot place with so many different peoples from so many different places. All of these things that they were complaining about in the East were equally true, at least as true in the West, but that's not the West that they created. The West that they created was one of, like this, of escape, of color, of excitement, of individualism. And that's the West, of course, that we would inherit into the 20th century.
Well, Elliot, if you would be good enough to pass the baton back to me, I will wrap the seminar up. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is your opportunity, the last shot, so to speak. Have we addressed your questions? We certainly hope so. If we haven't, please feel free to send us text messages or emails via the website so that we can consider them and supplement the material that we have presented to you tonight. Elliot, I wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts here. We'll go to this slide about the forum in just a moment, but any final thoughts from Professor West?
No, I don't think so, except I would ask you to go back to the original points that I was trying to make now that we've gone through the material, and to think once again how we might more, I think, effectively and truly bring the West more into the larger narrative of American history. It's really one of the most extraordinary parts of American history that I know.
Fair enough. Ladies and gentlemen, we encourage you to use the forum function on the website to continue the discussion, to share fresh approaches. We will monitor that forum until March 14th, 2013. We also ask you please to check out the remaining spring seminars upcoming from the National Humanities Center. For instance, the causes and consequences of Indian removal. I noticed that a couple of folks asked about that kind of topic, and the emergence of Jim Crow. Those are set for March the 20th and for April the 16th. Well, please submit your evaluations. That, again, is very important to the Humanities Center so that we can get you and respond to your evaluations and get you the credit that you are due. I want to thank Professor Elliott West for his splendid presentation tonight. And I want to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your wonderful questions, your enthusiastic participation. Elliot, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but the chat function was start to finish. Full of stimulating and interesting comments. You had a terrific audience for your remarks.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our seminar. Thank you so much for your participation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at the National Humanities Center. This concludes our seminar on the economic development of the American West. Thank you. To sign out of the seminar, folks, you go up to File on the upper left-hand